You're listening to the Meditation and Attachment Podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is Meditation and Attachment, Deepening Your Practice. It is September 2nd, 2021 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I thought because we have been going over the individual Brahma Viharas, loving kindness practice, compassion practice, sympathetic joy practice, and equanimity practice, that we should talk about them together as a group of strategies that you can use, which are really intended to develop a strong capacity for positivity. And that what we're orienting ourselves toward is a constant mindfulness where we're tracking the present moment experience and noticing conditioning, which is likely to lead to negative thought patterns arising, and then intentionally shifting them so that we're in a state of positivity. In the Tibetan practice of when I met Dan, he was the first Tibetan teacher who I found who was actually kind enough that I would be willing to learn from him, because most of my previous encounters with teachers in different Tibetan lineages, which was that they were, at least my perception of them was that they were mean, and I don't like it. It doesn't work for me. I feel too guarded and it's hard to take in what they're saying. But Dan was quite kind, and he said that you want to intentionally direct the mind toward positivity, and if you can go for 13 years with no negative thought, then you can dissolve into rainbow body, which I had not heard of prior to that. So you just dissolve into a light of positivity. But along the lines, before you completely dissolve into the white light, if you can redirect your mind out of negative states into positive states, it's just more enjoyable to be here and now in the present moment. A lot of times when we come into the practice, we don't really monitor our thought processes. And if you look at it through the attachment lens, it's really the subject of mentalizing, the ability to be in the present moment, monitoring your thought patterns without interfering with the spontaneous arising of them. And then having agency to direct the mind toward positive experiences. Most of us come out of childhood, and in childhood, we begin to take on the emotional regulation strategies that our caregivers instruct us in. We're all born as auto-regulators. We don't really have the capacity to recognize that there are people outside of ourselves. If you've ever been around an infant, you know, under say 5 months old, it really doesn't matter to them specifically who's attending to them. Anyone can attend to them. I know that as parents or people who are related to infants, we do like to personalize their expressions, but they're fairly instinctual rather than specific towards somebody. And then as the brain develops, between say 5 and 8 months, the brain develops sufficiently that children can begin to recognize specific caregivers and to develop a preference for one caregiver over another. We call that the beginning of the attachment list, or the hierarchy of attachment figures in the list. Children tend to pick a primary caregiver and open to the experience of learning from them. We call that epistemic trust. Epistemic trust means that You believe that the person is telling you the truth, and you believe what they're telling you is meant to be helpful to you. And because those conditions are in place, you can learn from them. If epistemic trust is broken, then you don't believe they're telling you the truth. You don't believe that they have their best interest, and you block the transmission of information that they might offer you. Between 5 and 8 months, say a child begins to develop a hierarchy of preferences in relationship, and they tend to focus on one primary caregiver. And we call it in our culture stranger anxiety, that if a child sees somebody that they don't know, they become frightened by that, and that activates their attachment system, which turns them toward the caregiver. If the caregiver comes reliably enough, the infant moves out of autoregulation into an externally regulating state, where the emotional regulation strategies of the caregiver the child uses to regulate their internal states. If the caregiver comes reliably enough, then the child moves into a collaborative experience of care. They express themselves, the caregiver understands what the expression is, and then responds by meeting their needs. So there's a process of mirroring back to the child what the experience is, so that the child learns through the expressions on the face that to associate their internal states with a particular presentation that's coming at them. And then if the caregiver meets their needs well enough, they enter into a secure attachment bond with the caregiver, and they learn to collaborate with the caregiver in terms of the expression and the receiving of care. As the emotional regulation piece is instructed in this way to the child takes in those ways of regulating themselves, and they develop self-mastery around those skills. One of the things you may notice about the description that I've just given is that it's pre-autobiographical memory. So we take in a lot of this in this nonverbal exchange with our caregiver. I described the breadth of that. If you have sensitive enough caregivers meeting you, but that doesn't always happen, and sometimes the caregiver provides intermittent care or unreliable care, and so the child never settles into a kind of collaborative exchange. They never develop self-mastery. They remain dependent on the caregiver for emotional regulation. Christian?
Is that collaborative exchange what then allows the child to sort of take in either a safe or unsafe version of the outside world? Because I know a 6-month-old that suddenly became very skeptical of me, and I need to figure out how to fool that child into liking me, because it's wreaking havoc on my self-esteem.
Oh, well, that's a very interesting point. The primary caregiver feels this unconditional love and adjuration from the child, and everybody else feels the rejection of the child, because they have a solid preference for one person, and you become a little bit strange to them. And so part of that is going to be more contact, so that they recognize you, and a consistent response of delight to them. What often happens to children with secondary and tertiary caregivers is that the experience of rejection causes the secondary or tertiary caregivers to lose the sense of delight in the child, and then make a demand that the child take care of the emotional state of the caregiver, which is a kind of role reversing. This is a very natural thing that happens because the secondary and tertiary caregivers are not important at this phase of the development in the same way. And when they do become important, if they haven't been able to overcome their own conditioning around rejection, they don't show up for the child when the child turns to them, and they don't notice that actually they're the ones who are rejecting of the child, not the child rejecting of them. And so you just show up and you don't take it personally. You understand that this is the nature of the human condition, and you provide the care and the delight. There's a few tricks that you were asking for tricks. As long as the child can see the primary caregiver in the visual field, they don't feel as anxious. And so you can hold the child, but just turn them around so that they can see their caregiver. And then they'll very contentedly bounce up and down on your lap or walk around with you. But just be mindful that you keep orienting them toward the visual experience of their caregiver, if they're seeing, obviously, but or hearing. They need to have, they don't have the capacity to separate, so that they have to have some visual experience of the primary caregiver. So then you can wander around with the child and have an experience of the child, and the child will intermittently attend to you, as long as whenever they get a little bit fussy, you can just turn them around and they can see the person that they need to see, so that they feel a sense of safety and continuity. But you notice that switch between anybody's good, and then all of a sudden it's very specific in terms of what they need.
Yeah, I saw the kid, and then 2 weeks later I saw the kid again, and like just tears and terror all of a sudden. I was like, I didn't get like splashed in the face or something like that. I don't think I have new scars or.
Yeah, it wasn't that at all. It's just, oh no, it's somebody new. And you don't even have to be new. It's they're really at that point developing to the point where they want that symbiosis with the primary caregiver. Hopefully they get enough of that so that they don't worry about it. That's what happens when the attachment is insecure, and it depends. Kids whose caregivers are neglecting and consistently neglecting never move out of the auto-regulating stage, and so they never develop the rest of the system. They're just self-contained. Kids whose parents come unpredictably or unreliably develop. Gonna just. I forgot to set that. Become preoccupied with where the actual caregiver is, because they're unpredictable, and so they become preoccupied or worried about it. And really, what you're trying to do is have a child that can settle in. In that interval before autobiographical comes online, so depending on how that developed for you, and you may notice that if you think back into your early childhood, that you have experiences that you can remember, but they're individual experiences. It's not a continuous flow of memory. And then all of a sudden there's a more continuous flow of memory. That's when the autobiographical memory is coming online. Then you can begin to have a sense of remembering what the instructions were in terms of the family system for emotionally regulating. But most of the time, it's so well embedded in you that the shift between it just being purely nonverbal and being verbal, and then being unremembered and remembered, you shift into this, and you have the sense that it's always been like this. There isn't a before and after to create a contrast so that you can see the difference between the two. And depending on the emotional regulation strategies that the caregivers use to regulate you, you take these on as if that's the way it's universally done, that all people are like that. It's not, the capacity to mentalize is not yet developed in children. And so there's just this assumption that this is the world, and the world is the same for everybody. And particularly in our culture, where we tend to be isolated by socioeconomic groups, There isn't much contrast to create a different sense of it. And so you use these states, these systems of thought to regulate. Most people, the main form of emotional regulation is thinking. And so you think these thoughts and they're regulating. Something happens in the present moment. We take it in as data, sensing data. The object that can be sensed makes contact with the capacity to sense it. Consciousness of the sensing experience arises. It's evaluated for urgency. I like to say vagueness, the Pali word for that. Is it pleasant? Is it unpleasant? Is it neutral? We know from looking at brain science that there's a bias toward difficult or urgent material over everything else. 3/8 of a second to process that. Almost all information that would come in as sense data is not deemed important and is not processed into consciousness. And if it's pleasant and there's time to experience it, it's allowed into consciousness. So 3/8 of a second at half the intensity for negative experience, and half a second and twice the intensity for a pleasant experience to arise. And almost everything remains unconscious. So I like my neuroscience, and the group that I tend to use their numbers of evaluated the body mind. 11 million bits per second is what the body mind can take in, and 16 bits is what consciousness can represent. 1/6. So when I say almost everything is neutral, that's 10,999,984 bits just never get in. And then the 16 bits get in. I like to think of it not so much as the center where we make these decisions, but as the last chance veto button. Did you want to ask a question, Jake?
Yeah, I did. Something I've been thinking about, and I wondered what you thought about it, is does the sense of self really arise immediately out of the affective state? Like the feeling, the sense of feeling. What do you think about that?
I don't know that that's necessarily how I experience it.
Like a negative feeling may produce a negative association in the sense of self, or a positive feeling may produce a positive association in the sense of self.
I do think that there's a working model of the self, which are stored as gists or algorithms in memory, and that when they're activated, it plays, and the concert of those activations we identify in a particular way, and that the mind states or the different emotional states that are associated with that experience can be positive and negative. And
So you're saying more like sense of self is more related to memory than the affective state.
I would think that that would be true. Is that your experience?
Well, I was just kind of questioning based on my reading of the Buddhist suttas, because, you know, in the Paticca Samuppada, however you say it, the Vedana conditions tanha, and that tanha is really I see is the origin of the sense of self.
Uh-huh.
So sensations would immediately condition the sense of self, and then attachment would be like more associated with the memories. So it'd be Vedana, Pachaya, Tanha, Pachaya, Upadana. So that's just how I was constructing it, and I was wondering if how that how that sensed to you. That was just my question. That's it.
I wonder about that too, because the brain science is pretty reliable and clear that most of that process happens, whether the sense of self or the sense of knowing it is happening or not. And then in the experiences of going into these no self states where really there isn't any memory that comes from that there isn't really even any fixation or understanding of anything. One of the things that when I was practicing pretty hard in Shinzen's world, that it would be possible to go into what I thought of as a no self state and have a conversation with somebody, but not fixate any of the words, and still be able to speak, but not fixate anything that I said. And so there would be an exchange of communication, which most people reported as quite satisfying, but I wouldn't have any memory of it or experience of it. And I often found in interviewing with Shinzen that would be the experience. He wouldn't remember anything about the conversation because he wasn't in a sense of a self in that way.
I mean, that makes sense to me based on the idea that the affective state would be one that's really based on the perception of impermanence. Like the perception of impermanence produces a particular type of affective state, and then that affective state produces following conditions without the sense of self in them.
Right. But as a householder, not so useful necessarily.
Okay.
And which brings me to actually quite an interesting thought process in myself, is coming into that state where everything is really quite pleasant, and the aftermath of that state is really quite pleasant and lasts, and produces a sense of profound well-being. And yet the sense of self arises, and there's an attachment to the meaning that the sense of self generates in response to all of this, is ultimately liberation, just where there's no sense of need to attach any of that, and it's simply unknown, all of that in being. I can tell from my own experience that it doesn't feel rewarding to be in relationship to somebody who has no memory of any of the interactions that we have. And so, and I notice in the world that, particularly in the Buddhist world, there's not what I think of as a sufficient response to the injustices of the world and the suffering of the world, that I also wonder, does that come from this place of simply being able to drop out of all of that and be in this sort of undifferentiated energy, and then how do you make sense of that?
Perhaps it's related to this theory of metacognition as part of growing up. I know that's something that's influenced Dan's teaching a bit, this whole teaching of Ken Wilber's about the theory of growing up as metacognitive stages, but it's something I haven't really been able to understand much about yet.
So Shinzen used to say that you want to be able to move effortlessly between the fixated self state and the unfixated non-self state, so that there's no suffering. But then when you need the experience of the brilliant, capable self, it's immediately available to you, and you can use it as an instrument for action in the world. And then when you don't need it, it just dissolves. But what I notice is, in making that brilliant sense of self, really what is embedded in it is a lot of positivity. Because if the sense of self arises and it's filled with a lot of negativity, then each time the sense of self arises, you're filled with these extreme negative states. And that can be the thing that really pushes people into an aversive response to the experience of the sense of self arising. That in a mind that isn't really tracking that, it can actually turn into a kind of self-hatred. So the sense of self arises, it's embedded with negative states. Negative states arise in the body, there's an immediate aversion to them, and then the self-generated thought processes that are used to regulate the aversive response to that particular sense of self tends to be generating the anger or self-hatred that people experience often, without the consciousness or the investigation, in the sense that understanding that actually these thought processes are not necessarily problematic in themselves, that the conditioned content of them that is learned in the family system is really what's at issue here. But that what the body mind is attempting to do is to use its capacity to regulate itself with the tools that it has, and that system of regulation is actually useful. And what needs to happen is that you need to train the mind out of using these negative thought systems or patterns into positive systems, so that you regulate yourself through joyfulness, or you regulate yourself through compassion, or you regulate yourself through loving kindness, and not through the far enemies of those.
George, can I follow up on that?
Sure.
So I feel like when I'm around people that regulate with afflictive strategies, and I'm using a beneficial, positive strategy,
Right.
I feel like I'm the weirdo that's happy and everyone's seething with hatred. I feel like compassion practice, some kind, is more appropriate. It's still good.
Uh-huh.
It's not a...
It's an interesting thing, positivity. I was talking to somebody, and apparently there's a term called posi, which I'd never heard before, which is slang in hardcore kids about thinking positive thoughts when you're supposed to be thinking, death metal, and actually talking about the persona of positivity as something that is brave to present, because the anger, the hardness is more socially valuable.
Yeah. Sometimes it could be inappropriate or dangerous to have an expressed positive affect around people that have really strong negative affects and aren't mentalizing that. It's happened to me where I'm in a situation where people are just having an undertone of negative affect, and then I try to overcompensate the situation and give like a big goofy smile or something. Right. And I look like a total enemy, like a total jerk. So maybe that's where equanimity comes in. You have to mentalize the situation and use equanimity sometimes.
Right. It in some ways sounds like, without suggesting you're doing anything wrong, that they feel unseen by your response.
Yeah, right. And it was a very kind of unempathetic situation. It was kind of like a defensive thing,
Right.
How am I going to defend myself? Like rejecting negativity, rejecting this negative situation instead of accepting and empathizing with it.
Right. So, you've often heard me say that when somebody comes at you, you want to try and evaluate their state of mind so you know how to respond to it. And I always say, make a joke, which is what it sounds like you're doing. And they're responding in a negative way, which would give you the information that they just need emotional soothing. You can't reason with them at all because they're beyond reason in that moment. And so you just flip into some kind of emotional regulation strategy that would work with them. And then after you've regulated them to the point where you think that the cognitive capacity might come back online, that is to say, they're re-mentalized. You've somehow scaffolded their mentalizing so that that function comes back online. Then you can go in and try and understand cognitively what's happening. Is that making sense? It's a lot of attention toward somebody else. And one of the things about structuring this use of your energy in terms of caring for other people is that you want to flow a lot of energy into the people that are close to you and a lot less energy into the people that are not close to you, which is not the same thing as not attending to anything, but and also some things you tell, some expressions you make to people that aren't close to you, and then you're free to express yourself completely with people that are close to you. But the people that are close to you because they've demonstrated their trustworthiness. They've demonstrated their sensitivity, and it's reliable. We sometimes make we often, as insecure people, rush in too quickly into relationships without actually figuring out whether the person is trustworthy or not, and then have a negative outcome, and that reinforces the sense that it isn't a place where you can just be open, and that conditioning is hard to overcome, particularly if the early family system is also in that way. So I do recommend that you spend time evaluating your thought processes and that you abandon the afflictive thought processes pretty much wholesale and retrain the mind to just work in positive thought processes. Any emotional situation that you can regulate with negative situations, you can also regulate with positive thought processes. It's just a lot less demanding on the body-mind system, and also it's a lot safer in terms of people being able to connect to you. One of the conversations I was having earlier today with somebody who, and this is, we call this the CCRT, or the core conflict resolution themes. They come from very different family systems, and the conflict negotiation systems in the two family groups are really not compatible. And they didn't succeed in negotiating the definitions of that well enough. And so both parties in the relationship have a completely different reference to what happened, which was one person expressed verbally intensely angry thoughts to somebody who never had that experience. They don't know what to make of it. It's frightening and dangerous to them. And the simple expression of that anger, that in a relationship with somebody who was used to those kinds of expressions, it wouldn't have been that big a deal, shattered the epistemic trust in the relationship. And it's really hard to repair that once that happens. So pay attention to that. Moving in the direction of positivity also means that all of that anger, all of that cruelty, all of that sort of envy and jealousy gets replaced. And so if those are driving forces, those are energies that you use to fuel the things that you do in your life, you're going to be without those energies to do it. I remember How long ago would have that been? Quite a long time ago. So late 90s. I was sitting Shinzen, and I was doing these long retreats. He at that time it was not uncommon for him to do, say, a 15-day retreat, and I was sitting with releasing anger and releasing anger and releasing anger, and then I got to the end of the anger pool and didn't have that constant energy of anger, and it completely transformed my social landscape, because the people that relied on me to be angry wanted the anger. That was part of the basis of the relationship. And when I didn't have it anymore, I couldn't meet their needs in the relationship. And in a period of about a month, most of the people that relied on me as a steady source of anger simply abandoned me because I couldn't provide for them what they wanted. It was quite surprising, Christian.
Did you come to the conclusion that there was some useful context for anger in your life, or did you just go, this isn't serving me in any way?
Well, I had up until that time had it reported back to me a lot that my anger was so intense that it was frightening, and that because of that, and because of the unpredictable nature of the outbursts, that they didn't want to be close to me. And that actually was the main motivation, because I wanted to be close and they were too afraid of me to be close. And so when I initially touched into the somaticized emotion, I had a lot of different kinds of somaticized emotion, but nobody had ever said that I was too sad that they didn't want to be near me, or that I was too fearful and they didn't want to be near me. They all said, when you go off, it is really scary, and I'm always on guard around you, wondering when that's going to be. And it wasn't that often. I mean, at least it didn't seem to me to be that often, but it was frightening enough that that was an unsurprising thing that somebody might say to me.
So I guess what I'm getting at is I can contextualize skillful uses of anger in terms of like recognizing and fighting against some kind of injustice or setting boundaries. Not that it's necessary for setting boundaries, but I could see that if you got rid of that, you might go so far.
Is there a boundary that you could set with anger that you couldn't also set with kindness?
Maybe not. Maybe I could see it in a very like visceral, maybe that's not the word, visceral kind of situation where something is happening and you need to react very quickly, and that might be the most skillful action.
So then that would be a different experience, I would think. The brainstem is one part and the prefrontal cortex is another. So it's what I say. So you're standing on the street talking to somebody, and a drunk driver veers out of control, bumps up on the curb, and almost runs you down, and you jump out of the way in a peak of anger. Nothing you can do about that, because it happens before consciousness.
And then you run after him and pull him out of the car and beat him up.
Then you run down the block screaming obscenities at him. That would be the prefrontal cortex. Something else, which you have total, well, in theory, total choice as to whether you allow that to happen, right?
Right.
So I would say you can't do anything about the brainstem's automatic responses because it precedes knowing about them, but the secondary stuff that you can. And then can you find a situation where anger in a secondary form would be necessary, and that there wouldn't be an alternative that was positive that you couldn't use instead?
I guess, this is a big question, but I can see it in terms of like we have various underclasses in this country, and like if like I think the quote is like anger or rage or something is the voice of like the, anyway, I'm messing up the quote, but like for people that have been in a class system that has kind of shoved them down the whole time, there's kind of righteous anger that that's like, how am I going to address this injustice?
One of the things that I've noticed about the resistance that's necessary to change these things is that the people who get angry burn out long before the need for the resistance is over, and that they drop out. And that the people who can come from a place of positivity endure and endure and endure and resist and resist and resist long enough that something can actually change. I don't know that what comes to mind is the reconciliation process in South Africa, say, is more effective in change or than the anger, which often leads to violence. Stas?
Kind of lost track. We went a pretty different direction. The thread I was gonna go off of. So there's somaticized emotion and pool work.
Right.
There's the rainbow body and positivity.
Say work.
Okay.
I guess. How long can you go without a negative thought? If you were me, it would not be very long. We would not be talking minutes yet. And so this is, I mean, how automatic is all of this, right? I will wake up from a dream with my mind engaged in negative thoughts, recognize that my mind has been engaged in negative thoughts and shifted into a positive thought and go back to sleep. I will be walking along or engaged in something, and I'll notice the process of negative thoughts just spontaneously arising. And as soon as I catch it, I redirect it. My mind also, one of the dominant negative thoughts that my mind generates is fear. And fear has a very visceral experience in the body, which is, I find, really, for the most part, unpleasant. And so I have motivation to really change it as fast as I can. But the process is so deeply embedded that it's often before I'm even aware that that's what the response is arising in consciousness. So it's a constant process of retraining. Is that making sense?
Making perfect sense. So just so I'm clear, I mean, I feel like the somatic work and the positivity work, I mean, it's kind of the same thing like you're saying, but also if you can resolve the pools, I mean, like in your case and my experience, it can have a drastic shift.
Well, one of the things that happens with the somaticized emotional experience, of course, you have the present moment, the reaction to the present moment. There's usually an emotional response. And if it's in the same resonance as the pool, it begins to resonate the pool. And then you have the pool work that comes in. I mean, the expression of that somaticized emotion, if it exceeds the window of tolerance, then the mind just turns on the same old thought that generated the pool in the first place. And you're, as fast as you're bailing, the water is pouring into the boat. And so you have to do both the releasing of the old and also the preventing of the mind from continuously refilling it, so that you can get to the place where that doesn't happen anymore.
So that's the 4 right efforts.
And it is so much energy. That's the part that was really mind-blowing to me, is doing that somaticized emotional work released so much energy that I could then use for other things. And that became something that people complained about. I had too much energy.
You can't do anything right.
No, absolutely. So why don't we do some practice? If you had a choice of one of the Brahma Viharas to do, which one would you like to do?
I like equanimity.
Okay. We have one vote for equanimity. Jake?
I'd suggest sympathetic joy.
Okay.
Hey,
as
George,
it's, connect,
Uh-huh.
as it's connected to attachment.
Julia's
Okay.
going to be meditating with us.
Oh,
whichever,
good.
So whichever is easier for her to understand. She has something she wants to say to you.
Okay.
So, I have secure attachment.
Yay!
What's so funny about it? What's so funny about it?
I'm not saying it's funny. I'm saying I think that's wonderful.
Okay. She's going to do 30 minutes with us, right? George is going to be watching you, okay, Julia?
Okay.
Let's do metta, because that's the easiest one, I think. All right. So everybody settle in. So any comments or questions on the practice that we just did? So Stas?
So I think I remember you telling that Dan reprimanded you at some point about holding or not holding the view, but focusing on how it changing your perception.
Uh-huh. So I was talking to him about the 6 lamps meditation, and how intensely pleasant the sensations in the body were after doing that practice for a while. And he said that I was too much in the body and I needed to return to the view. That's what I came to mind. Is that what you meant?
I think so.
Yeah.
Does that apply to metta practice?
Well, in this particular way of practicing, there really is no attention to the body at all. It's all view, all mind state. Any experience in the body can happen. It's just it just really does drift into the background, and then when you experience it, you're just experiencing it through the view. This is the difference between the wet and dry metta practice. In wet metta, you're using phrases to generate positive feeling states, which is a kind of self-generated emotion, which is fine as long as you're staying in the experience of the present moment. It's easy to slip into sentimentality, and then actually you're just caught up in the thinking process and not actually in metta mind. And the utility for the attachment work, but also for understanding the nature of enlightenment really does require the understanding and some agency in views or mind states. And so that's why I prefer this concentration oriented practice. Good enough. Juliet?
Well, I didn't get the easy person part.
No? What about for yourself?
I was like, what about for mommy?
Well, I was thinking maybe the panda would have been easy.
Yeah, the panda. She said she felt like the see here feel was much easier.
Oh, okay, good. Yes, this is a little bit of an advancement. Were you able to repeat the phrase okay? No.
Yes
So,
or no?
yes, good. So then we'll start there. But also remember, if you can't do the meta meditation, it's okay to go back and do the see, hear, feel instead.
Or just do it for mommy.
Yes.
Just push.
Someone else? Christian.
Just real quick, because I hate when I butcher quotes. I think the quote I was trying to get was the riot is the language of the unheard.
Right.
Anyway, but regarding
Children throw rocks at tanks because that's all they have, and then they're met with machine gun bullets. One of the things, maybe a few years ago, I found that anger was completely overriding my mind because the injustice was so terrible. And I can't remember in particular what it was, but then I decided I would reread people on the utility of a violent, angry response versus a compassionate, kind response. And actually, it was Noam Chomsky's work that was the most moving to me in the way that I think. He said that the right, in this case, the people who have power are constantly attempting to provoke the people who are powerless into violence, because as soon as they make it their very minimal expression, like a child throwing a rock at a tank, the disproportionate response is to level the town. And they have the capacity to do that. And they completely crush it and justify it. If you look at what's been happening in Myanmar, the military justified the removal of 800,000 Rohingya because a police station was attacked and 12 officers were killed. This is the habit of the disproportionate response. So you see in this country the right provoking insurrection in an attempt to generate that kind of outrage, and then the disproportionate response, which is almost always a hard swing to the right, to fascism and that kind of suppression that and oppression that comes from that. And so we have to pay attention to this intentional provocation that is meant to generate violent response so that they can justify that extreme reaction. I mean, it's farcical that you could say that an attack on a police station justified the forced removal of 800,000 people. It's just disproportionate. Or if you look at the bombing of the World Trade Center, thousands of lives were lost. And what was the response to that? How many civilians were killed in response to that? 500,000, a million, 1.5 million, $1 billion or $2 billion worth of damage. And the response was $6.6 trillion in war. I mean, it's just really important, I think, to pay attention to that.
I'm de-escalated.
Yes.
I did have a question about the mind state.
Uh-huh.
I'm trying to parse out the sending or the intention aspect, and I'm trying to figure out whether that's like a component of the mind state itself or if that kind of powers it up. And I'm wondering how you experience that, because it seems like it's a really integral, like when I have the sending, like that sort of outward
Right.
send to whoever, that, or even to myself, that's, I'm trying to figure out if that's the mind state, if that's part of the mind state, or if that supports it.
This is we're entering into this metaphysical part of the understanding of Buddhism, that without that sending out, without the intention to radiate it outward, without it being received by the target and then sent back, it was explained to me that you can't come into the high concentration state. So it's a necessary piece of this, and it creates this cycle of exchange. And so I don't find a need to question that, so I just sort of go with the instructions the way that they're given. But then you might be reporting that actually is your experience, with that when you radiate outward, the metta mind is reinforced in a way that it isn't if you don't.
Yeah, there seems to almost be a sort of direction or a physical component to it. Even when I do it for myself, it's like I did this thing where I was imagining myself looking very like delightfully upon myself, which is weird layers of meta, but
and attachment.
Yeah, right. I'm just making a big gumbo at this point. But there does seem to be that direction to it that seems like an important part of it, but I'm not sure if that's exactly the mind state, or if that just really like if that's like a scaffolding for the mind state.
Right. You will be able to figure that out.
George,
Jake? Uh-huh.
have you ever thought about connecting your metta practice to Satipatthana? Or integrating it? Have you thought through how to integrate your metta instruction with Satipatthana?
I kind of teach metta vipassana, and so yeah, I think that you can at any point investigate the states that come up in metta with insight.
Okay.
Very good to see you all. We're out of time. There's a few things coming up. We do have a level 2 class starting September 16th. It is nearly full, so take a look at that. We have made some spaces for Donna participation this time around, because we've run out of scholarship funds. The other thing that's happening is our December retreat, which is an in-person retreat in the Sierras. There are 5 spaces left in that, if you're interested in that. And that's, I think, pretty much it for the rest of the year. We are going to do another series of level 1s in November. Anyway, it should be up on the website at some point. We're going to just do the 3 day-longs associated with level 1 and not do the couples class this round. So take a look at that if you want to do that. And then we will start in the winter another level 2 class then. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that you'll make a donation to Mettagroup. It does help with the work that Mettagroup is doing and also help support me. You can find a link on the website if you're able to make a donation. Any amount is appreciated. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you soon, I hope, somewhere on the path. Bye.